My neighbor's insane son took my dog's life. I pressed charges to get justice, but his mother started lying about me and fabricating evidence, and even tried setting my house on fire. My neighbor's 23-year-old son is a nightmare to live beside, and I quickly realized this when on my first day he pulled an armed robbery prank. He knocked on my door with a mask, and when I answered he pulled out a knife. He walked in and took out some rope, then tied my hands behind my back, and only then did he take his mask off and reveal this was a prank. In the following weeks, he uprooted the flowers in my garden because they were too pretty, keyed my car after I told him off for the uprooting, and even placed a ladder against my house, then climbed in through the window to snoop while I was in the bath. About a month in, I was walking my dog when he came outside with this violent look. I'm not sure why he was mad, but he aggressively grabbed my arm and went to yell at me, but my 5-month-old Jack Russell defended me by biting him in the leg. He went to kick my dog and wouldn't stop swinging his foot till he connected with my puppy's nose, making him squeal. I verbally tore him a new one, but instead of listening, he walked away, telling me to say goodbye to the little piece of crap. That night, I woke up to find my puppy not in my bed, but in my backyard. He was covered in his own red, he wasn't breathing, and there was a massive wound in his abdomen. That night, as I stood in my backyard, staring at Max's lifeless body, the tears I had been holding back broke free. I screamed into the night, a raw, gut-wrenching sound, full of pain and rage. This wasn't just a senseless act of cruelty, it was personal. Jeremy had killed Max because he could, because he knew it would hurt me, and his mother would probably excuse it like she had with everything else. The police arrived not long after I called them, my hands still shaking as I explained the situation. But, just as I feared, they seemed disinterested in doing anything. Without any hard proof, they said, their hands were tied. They filed a report, promised to look into it, but I could tell from their tone that they considered this a non-issue. I was devastated. Max wasn't just a pet, he was my companion, my family, and Jeremy had taken him from me, without consequence. In the following days, Jeremy's behavior worsened. I could barely step outside my house without seeing him standing on his porch, staring at me with that smug, menacing grin. He knew the police weren't going to do anything, and now he was emboldened. Every glance, every smirk, felt like a reminder that he could do whatever he wanted, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. I tried to keep to myself, hoping that if I ignored him, he might lose interest, but he didn't. One evening, I came home to find my garden destroyed again. The flowers I had painstakingly replanted after the last time were ripped from the ground, their stems broken and scattered across the lawn. My blood boiled, but what could I do? No one would listen. Not the police, not the neighbors, and certainly not his mother, Linda. A few days later, Linda showed up at my door. I hadn't seen her much since Max died, and part of me had hoped that she was embarrassed by her son's behavior. But as soon as I saw her standing there with that familiar forced smile, I knew better. I just wanted to stop by and clear the air, she said, her voice dripping with false concern. I know Jeremy can be a bit rough around the edges, but he's not a bad boy. He just gets carried away sometimes. Carried away? My dog was dead. My garden was ruined. My car had been keyed. But to her, it was just Jeremy being Jeremy. I'm sorry about what happened to Max, she continued, as if that half-hearted apology could erase what had been done. But you know how animals can get. You shouldn't leave them unsupervised. I stared at her, my mouth hanging open in disbelief. She was blaming me. Somehow, in her twisted mind, this was my fault. Your son unalived my dog, I said, my voice cold and steady. And if you don't do something about him, it's only going to get worse. Linda's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. Jeremy didn't mean for things to go that far. He just has a temper, you know? But he's a good boy at heart. I think you two just got off on the wrong foot. Wrong foot? I wanted to scream. Instead, I simply slammed the door in her face. The next week was hell. Jeremy's presence loomed over me, even when I couldn't see him. I felt trapped in my own home, constantly on edge, waiting for the next prank or act of vandalism. Every time I heard a noise outside, my heart raced, fearing he was back to destroy something else. And then, he escalated. It was late one night when I heard footsteps on my porch. I froze, listening as they moved closer to the front door. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept toward the window, peeking through the blinds. Jeremy was standing there, staring at my front door. For a moment, I thought he was going to break in again, like he had the day he climbed through my window. But instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, slipping it under the door. I didn't move until I heard him walk away, his footsteps fading into the night. Only then did I gather the courage to open the door and retrieve the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and my stomach turned as I read the words, "Say goodbye to your house next." I sat down, clutching the letter, my mind racing. This wasn't just a prank anymore. Jeremy was threatening me. I couldn't live like this. Something had to change. The next day, I went to the police station again. I brought the letter, explained everything that had happened since Max's death. The officer at the desk listened patiently, but his expression told me what I already knew. Without hard evidence, there was little they could do. I left the station feeling defeated, but I wasn't going to give up. I started documenting everything. I installed security cameras around my property, hoping that if Jeremy tried something again, I'd catch him in the act. I started keeping a detailed journal of every interaction, every threat, every act of vandalism. I was determined to build a case, no matter how long it took. In the meantime, Jeremy didn't let up. A few days after the letter, I woke up to find my car's tires slashed. The cameras didn't catch him in the act, but I knew it was him. I could see him smirking at me from across the street as I called a tow truck to come and replace the tires. Linda, of course, said nothing. She continued to pretend that nothing was wrong, waving at me whenever I passed her house, as if her son wasn't systematically trying to ruin my life. A month after Max's death, the harassment reached a boiling point. It was early evening, and I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard a loud crash from the backyard. I rushed outside, heart pounding, only to find that someone had thrown a brick through my sliding glass door. The glass was shattered, shards scattered across the deck. Attached to the brick was another note. "Next time, it'll be you." I felt sick. This wasn't just vandalism anymore. This was a direct threat against my life. I called the police again, my hands trembling as I explained what had happened. This time, they took it seriously. An officer arrived within minutes, taking photos of the damage and the note. I showed them the security footage, which had captured someone in a hoodie running away from my yard, but it wasn't clear enough to make a positive identification. Still, the officer promised to keep a patrol car nearby for the next few nights, just in case. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. Jeremy seemed to have backed off, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe the police presence had scared him off. Maybe he'd finally gotten bored and moved on to someone else. But then, one evening, I was walking back from the store when I saw smoke rising from the side of my house. My heart stopped. I dropped the grocery bags and ran toward the house, praying that I was wrong. But as I rounded the corner, I saw the flames. My shed was on fire. I screamed, running for the garden hose. But by the time I managed to douse the flames, the shed was nothing but a smoldering heap of charred wood. Everything inside, tools, lawn equipment, old photos, was destroyed. I stood there, staring at the destruction, my hands shaking with rage. This was it. This was the final straw. Jeremy had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. The next morning, I took all the evidence I had gathered, the letters, the security footage, the journal I had been keeping, and went back to the police station. I wasn't going to leave until they took action. I sat in the waiting area for what felt like hours before a detective finally agreed to meet with me. I laid everything out, explaining the escalation of Jeremy's behavior over the past few months. The detective listened carefully, taking notes as I spoke. When I showed him the footage of the person running from my yard after the brick was thrown, he paused. "We might be able to get something from this," he said, examining the footage more closely. "It's not the best quality, but it's enough to start an investigation." For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Jeremy would finally face consequences for his actions. Over the next few weeks, the police investigation moved forward. They interviewed Jeremy, but of course he denied everything. Linda, as expected, backed him up, insisting that her son was being unfairly targeted. But the evidence was starting to pile up. The security footage, combined with the letters and the pattern of harassment, was enough to make a case. Then, one evening, I got a call from the detective. They had arrested Jeremy, but it wasn't for the shed fire, or the threats, or even the vandalism. It was something far worse. Jeremy had been caught trying to break into another neighbor's house. The police had found him in the act, and when they searched his belongings, they found evidence linking him to a string of break-ins around the neighborhood. He hadn't just been targeting me, he had been terrorizing the entire community. I was shocked. I had known Jeremy was dangerous, but I hadn't realized the full extent of his crimes. Finally, he was facing the consequences of his actions. The next morning, after Jeremy's arrest, I stood in my backyard where my shed had once been. The charred remains were a reminder of how much my life had changed in just a few short months. My peaceful little home had turned into a place of fear, torment, and violence, all thanks to one person. It wasn't just about the material losses, the shed, the garden, Max. It was about the sense of security I had lost, and how it had all been stripped away by Jeremy's relentless torment. As I walked through the yard, my mind wandered back to the day I had moved in. Back then, I had been full of hope. I had thought this house would be a fresh start, a new beginning after leaving behind a toxic relationship and a stressful job. Now, it felt like I had traded one nightmare for another. I spent that day cleaning up the remains of the shed, trying to salvage what little I could. Most of it was gone, burnt beyond recognition. I found a few tools, charred and blackened, but nothing of real value. As I worked, I couldn't help but wonder how much of my life Jeremy had ruined that I wasn't even aware of yet. Had he gone through my things before? Had he been in my house when I wasn't home, snooping, planning his next move? It made my skin crawl. I had installed the cameras too late to catch most of his actions, but knowing that I had at least some proof now gave me a small sense of relief. But it didn't change the fact that for months, he had gotten away with terrorizing me without any consequences. Later that day, I received a knock on the door. For a split second, my heart raced, but when I looked through the peephole, I saw that it was the detective who had been working on the case. I opened the door, and he gave me a sympathetic smile. "Good news," he said. "Jeremy's been denied bail. He's not going anywhere anytime soon." I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Finally, a bit of justice. "Thank you," I said, my voice shaky but relieved. "There's more," he continued. continued. We found some things when we searched his phone. Evidence that he'd been planning to break into your house next. He had photos of your place, taken at different times of the day, notes about your routine. It seems like the fire was just the beginning. A chill ran down my spine. I had known he was dangerous, but hearing that he had been actively planning something worse made me feel sick. The detective handed me his card and told me to call if I needed anything else. I thanked him again and closed the door, leaning against it for support. Jeremy had been closer to destroying my life than I'd realized. In the days following Jeremy's arrest, I started to notice just how much the neighborhood had changed during his reign of terror. I hadn't been the only one dealing with his awful behavior. Some of the other neighbors began approaching me, telling me their own stories. Apparently, Jeremy had a history of bullying and intimidation. Even before I moved in, he had vandalized other properties, harassed other neighbors, and yet no one had ever done anything about it. People were too scared, or they simply didn't want to get involved. I started to feel angry, not just at Jeremy, but at the entire system that had allowed this to go on for so long. Why hadn't anyone spoken up sooner? Why had it taken something as extreme as setting my shed on fire to get him arrested? I wasn't the first person he had tormented, and I doubted I would be the last. As the weeks went by, I tried to get back to normal, but the damage was done. My once beautiful garden was still a wreck, and every time I stepped outside, I half expected to see Jeremy lurking in the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, even from jail. I knew it was irrational, but after everything I had been through, it was hard to feel safe again. I tried to focus on work, but even that became difficult. Every time I heard a noise outside or saw a shadow out of the corner of my eye, my heart raced. I started double-checking the locks on my doors and windows, even in broad daylight. I knew Jeremy couldn't physically hurt me anymore, but the mental toll of living under constant threat had left its mark. One afternoon, as I sat in my living room, I noticed a car slowly driving by my house. It wasn't the first time I had seen it. In fact, I had noticed it several times over the past few days. It would slow down just enough to be suspicious before speeding up and driving away. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it was probably just someone lost or curious. But when it happened again, I started to worry. I jotted down the license plate number and called the police. They assured me they'd look into it, but I could tell they didn't take it too seriously. After all, Jeremy was in jail. It couldn't be him, right? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every distant car engine made me tense up. I kept thinking about the car that had been circling my block. What if it was someone connected to Jeremy? What if his family was trying to intimidate me now? I knew Linda was still living next door, and although she hadn't bothered me much since the arrest, I didn't trust her. She had always defended Jeremy, no matter how horrible his behavior was. She had excused every single thing he had done to me. Why wouldn't she try to get revenge now? A few days later, the car showed up again. This time, it parked at the end of the street. I couldn't see who was inside, but my gut told me something wasn't right. I called the detective and explained the situation. He agreed to send a patrol car to drive through the neighborhood more frequently. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As the court date for Jeremy's trial approached, I started receiving anonymous letters. They were always typed, with no return address, but the content was clear. Whoever was sending them was trying to scare me. The first one was simple: drop the charges, or else. I brought the letters to the police, but they couldn't trace them back to anyone. I suspected Linda was behind them. She had been quiet ever since Jeremy's arrest, but I could see her watching me from her porch whenever I left the house. It wouldn't surprise me if she was trying to intimidate me into backing down. She had always coddled Jeremy, treating him like he could do no wrong. I imagined her sitting at her kitchen table, typing out threats with that same smug smile she always wore when she defended her son. Despite the letters, I refused to back down. I had been through too much to give up now. I wanted Jeremy to face justice, not just for what he had done to me, but for everything he had put the entire neighborhood through. The day of the trial arrived, and I felt a mix of fear and relief. Jeremy was facing multiple charges, not just for the harassment and destruction he had caused to my property, but for the other break-ins and crimes the police had linked him to. As I sat in the courtroom, I felt the weight of everything I had endured. The anxiety, the fear, the helplessness. It had all led to this moment. Jeremy sat across the room, his expression blank. For someone who had caused so much pain, he looked oddly detached. I couldn't help but feel disgusted. Even now, he didn't seem to care about what he had done. When the prosecution presented the evidence, including the footage from my security cameras and the letters I had received, I felt a small sense of satisfaction. Finally, everything he had done was out in the open. The jury could see the full extent of his actions, and there was no way he could worm his way out of it this time. Linda sat behind him, her face twisted in anger. She glared at me throughout the trial, as if I were the one on trial. She still couldn't accept that her precious son wasn't the victim here. I avoided looking at her, focusing instead on the fact that justice was finally being served. In the end, Jeremy was found guilty on multiple charges. The judge sentenced him to several years in prison, and when I heard the verdict, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was over. The nightmare that had haunted me for months was finally over. As I walked walked out of the courtroom, I could feel Linda's eyes on me, but I didn't care. I had won. Jeremy would be behind bars, and I could finally begin to rebuild my life. Over the next few months, I slowly started to feel normal again. I replanted my garden, repaired the damage to my house, and did my best to move on. It wasn't easy. The scars that Jeremy had left, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. But with him gone, I could finally start to feel safe again. Max's memory stayed with me. I missed him every day, but I knew that I had done everything I could to honor him by standing up to the monster who had taken him from me. And as for Linda, I rarely saw her anymore. She kept to herself, likely humiliated by her son's conviction. Eventually, I heard through the grapevine that she had moved away. For the first time in months, I could finally breathe. With Jeremy in prison and Linda gone, my house no longer felt like a place of fear. It had taken time, but I had reclaimed my space. It wasn't the fresh start I had envisioned when I first moved in, but in a way, it was a new beginning, one that had been hard-earned through resilience and determination. The darkness that had clouded my life for so long had lifted, and for the first time, I could finally look toward the future without fear.